It's my privilege to be here with Professor Christine Hayes from the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University. And the first thing I'd love to ask you is just how you got involved, what pulled you into, I guess, Jewish studies, the study of the Bible itself, and what continues to keep you fascinated in this field.
I think, like a lot of people, your interest really develops when you have great teachers. So I was very fortunate as an undergraduate to have some wonderful teachers, and not just in religious studies generally, but in Jewish studies quite specifically. So I think some of the passion of those first teachers, united with my own great interest and desire to understand more about Jewish tradition and history and culture and religion. And at the end of the day, I can't really explain why that was the subject that I would burn the midnight oil for and stay up till 4 a.m. just wanting to read one more text and one more passage. That's just how it was. It was just a love affair with the text and the tradition that took off as an undergraduate.
Is there a specific teacher you can point to who really kind of ignited your interest?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to take a lecture course by Isidore Torsky and then to work in his office, and he was a reader for my senior thesis as well. So I got to know him a little bit within the classroom, but also in the working environment of the Jewish Studies program, where I was an assistant, and then also through my senior thesis project. So and then Jacob Milgram was probably a real inspiration to me in the field of Bible, as well as Robert Alter.
Yeah. So what's the value of studying religious texts, in particular the Bible, within a secular academic environment?
Well, I think especially a text like the Bible. I mean, I could give you certain standard answers that this is a classic text of the Western tradition, and so much of the history and the culture of the West really draws upon not only sort of narratives and characters and themes, but also just deeper ideas or the worldview that emerges from the biblical text. And all of that's true. That standard answer happens to be true. But I think one of the reasons it's important to study it in a sort of a non-denominational context, if you will, is because I've certainly found that many students walk into my classroom, which is an introduction to the Hebrew Bible. They walk into that classroom thinking that they know what the Bible is. Even students who've actually never even opened it are pretty sure they can tell you what's in it and what it says. Or they can imagine what its position would be on any number of things. In other words, we have such a thickly mediated sense of what this text is that I think there's real value in having students sit down in a classroom with a bunch of other brains with no question other than, what is this thing, right? Not, what will it do for me? How will it promote my political agenda? How will it validate my religious beliefs? What is this thing? If I were to open it up and meet it for the first time, how would it strike me? And what kinds of outside information do I need to know to contextualize it properly, to be able to understand it on its own terms instead of someone else's terms?
What are some of the strong emotional responses you get from students looking at the Bible? I mean, what are some of the areas of surprise, or is there some antagonism? Are students have a combative approach to some degree?
There's always surprise. And the great thing is that the surprise comes from all directions. So every now and then I'll have a student who might have a particularly strong religious background. It might be Jewish, it might even be Christian or evangelical or Bible reading Christian background. Not all Christians read the Bible, or they read certain portions of it that are rather important, meaning the Hebrew Bible. They're more focused on the New Testament. But I will often get students of a religious background who will come and say to me, well, I've heard the course is interesting, and I imagine it's different from what I know, but won't I be bored? Won't this be repetitive for me? I know all this about it. And of course I can hardly tell them, no, you won't be bored, but I'll say, why don't you come to the first couple of classes, or why don't you check out the videos online for the first couple of classes? I think you'll see that not only do you have there will be a lot that you'll be learning, there'll be a lot that you'll be unlearning, not in the sense of destroying anything, but clearing the way to see something that you maybe haven't been able to see before. And my experience has been that those students come back and tell me that that was absolutely true, and that they felt they were given a great gift to really be able to suddenly see something as if for the first time, something that they've known so well, but to now suddenly see it for the first time, and to really hear and understand more clearly why in its own time it was such a revolutionary text, or why even today it could be a revolutionary text if people would only read it instead of telling us what they think it says. So that's exciting when you get students who come from a background where they feel that they have probably very little to learn, and who come and tell you that in fact it was a completely transformative class, or something that where they learned more than they ever could imagine. And then there are students who are really have not encountered the text before, but they believe that it does or says certain sorts of things because it is so central to certain kinds of communities. And so they imagine that those communities must have the correct narrative about this text, right? So they're curious and they're interested, but they think they know what they're going to find.
Right.
And so they're really delighted and surprised to find that it's a text that they can connect with. They've sort of assumed that it's a text that's given over to certain communities or religious communities, and it's sort of their property and their possession and really can only speak to them. And they're delighted to find that as human beings, this is a text and a collection of writings and texts that they absolutely can resonate with them and provide really moving experiences for them. So different responses from different constituencies, but all really great responses.
Yeah. So there's so many of your wonderful books I want to talk about, but the one I'm most interested in talking about right now is your second one, which was Gentile Impurities and Jewish Identities, Intermarriage and Conversion from the Bible to the Talmud. I think a lot of moderns don't talk much about purity. It seems like sort of an ancient value or ritual, which, aside from very traditional people today, isn't discussed as much. Can you talk a little bit about, you can talk a lot about, but sort of what Tuma and Tahara, what purity and impurity mean in the biblical sense and in the rabbinic sense, and sort of some of this differentiation and the evolution of this differentiation between Jew and Gentile in this regard?
On one foot?
On one foot. Because you have a whole book on that topic. I don't know how you can say it in one foot, but so, I trust.
I think really one of the great pioneers for studying purity and impurity in the biblical context, and then folks have followed on to do work subsequent to the Bible. One of the great pioneers was my teacher, Jacob Milgram. So I really felt so fortunate that I was able to study with him. Jacob Milgram's work on the book of Leviticus was pioneering because he showed that behind the ritual behavior, the ritual laws, right, of purity and impurity, there was a great intentionality and a great design by the priestly authors that, unlike the cultures of the ancient Near East, the priestly authors chose certain very specific physical substances to convey impurity. And he began to determine what was sort of the common denominator of these substances. It's only certain fluxes from genitalia, and it's corpses, and then it's a sort of a skin disease, which is a sign of decomposition. In other words, he felt the common denominator in all of these was death, either the loss of life or corpse or flaking of skin disease. And that work's been refined by Jonathan Klawans, who says really the common denominators are death and sex. Death and sexuality, right? Our mortality and sexuality are the two features that mark humans as distinct from God. And that is why association with the realm of death or the realm of sexuality is inappropriate when one is about to enter the presence of God. And that's all ritual purity is in the biblical text. Ritual purity and impurity mark states of preparedness or unpreparedness to enter the presence of the holy. So if you're in a state of impurity, meaning you've had some recent connection, sort of immersing yourself in the realm of death or sexuality, that's, you probably don't want to be contacting the divine, right? The divine that's the opposite of what the divine is, which is life, right? And it's sort of eternal, right? Non-sexual being. So Milgram argued that there is a great intentionality and a sort of an important lesson in what seem to be the arbitrary rules of the priestly traditions, but they are markedly different from the surrounding cultures where any number of things, from hair to fingernail clippings, were impure and it seemed to be somewhat arbitrary. He saw this as a constructed and very purposeful moral message. All right, so that's ritual impurity on the one hand. But the Bible, as you may know, is composed of different texts written by different authors in different groups in different time periods. And so we have language of purity and impurity used in another way in the Bible, and that's to refer to a kind of moral impurity which arises from the commission of sin, Ritual impurity does not. Ritual impurity is sort of a symbolic system, a way of saying to people, associate yourself with and cleave to life, and dissociate yourself from things that have to do with death. But there's no sin in contracting a ritual impurity. There's no sin from being defiled by semen or menstrual blood. There's no sin in being defiled by a corpse. It's a mitzvah, in fact, to bury a corpse. It's a mitzvah to procreate. These happen to create states, though, where you shouldn't go to the temple. But there's no sin except in not removing it.
Right.
Okay? But moral impurity is sin that actually arises from the commission of sinful deeds. It defiles the land. It cannot be removed by ritual ablutions or the passage of time the way ritual impurity can. Moral impurity doesn't work that way. It has to be punished, or it can be given through repentance, right, and forgiveness and atonement and so on, but it operates in a different way. So we have these two types of impurity that are discussed in the biblical text, and they are then subject to really interesting history in the post-biblical tradition, where people will pick up this language of purity and impurity and use it in different ways. The book that you mentioned is an exploration of the way different Jewish groups used the language or the languages of impurity to inscribe the boundary between Jew and Gentile. How does a Gentile differ from a Jew? Do they differ in some pure and impure way? Is one pure and the other impure? And if so, is it a ritual impurity? Are Gentiles, is the boundary marker because Gentiles are somehow convey a ritual impurity, or they live in a state of ritual impurity because they don't observe the purity laws? Or is it that they are somehow morally impure? And if they're morally impure, is that an inherent quality they can never get rid of? Or is there some other sort of impurity going on? And those are actually the issues that I explore in the book. It's kind of complicated, but it's kind of fun to map out how different groups arrived at very different conclusions on those matters. I take most interest in the rabbis because although I do teach in the Bible, my own area of actual research interest is rabbinic, Talmudic rabbinic literature. So most of the book is looking at the very interesting way in which the rabbis use purity language to mark the difference between Jew and Gentile. And when you place it in the context of what other groups are doing at the time, including Paul, later the early Christian church, the sectarians at Qumran, we have this interesting sectarian group that lived off in the desert of Qumran. When you look at the way they were using the language and you kind of triangulate it, you realize that what the rabbis were doing was perhaps not as stringent a separation, let's say, as some other groups, and one that could in fact be crossed.
So can you differentiate a little bit between the biblical notion and versus the rabbinic notion? I know there's a lot of different strands within them, and their relationship to how Gentiles could have impurity, and what are the moral implications for Gentiles having impurity in Jewish thought?
It's pretty clear to me that in the biblical text, Gentiles do not bear a ritual impurity. That's quite clear, and I have many texts in the book that indicate that there's no problem with a Gentile making contact, a good-willed Gentile making contact with the holy. It's assumed that they can do that. They can bring sacrifices to the sanctuary. No one could do that if they were in a state of ritual impurity. So there are many ways in which it's clear that Gentiles, the laws applied to them in terms of access to the sancta, and they do not bear an intrinsic impurity, nor do they bear an impurity because of a failure to observe the laws of ritual impurity, because those laws apply only to the covenant partners. So the one that does apply to them is corpse impurity, but that I think has to do with the fact that the covenant with Noah is made with all of humankind. The spilling of blood is a prohibition on all of humankind. So the impurity that arises from corpses, I think that's why in the biblical text that is something that Gentiles can contract. They can also get impurity from contact with corpses.
So are you saying, sorry to cut you off, an Israelite who had an Israelite wife, an Israelite man with an Israelite wife, and a concubine Gentile would have different approaches to menstruation for the two?
If we're assuming that the laws of the laws in Leviticus 11 through 15 were fully applied in ancient Israelite times. Then I suppose that would be true. But at some point in history, if someone was in fact observing them and observing them in this line of reasoning, then that would be true. There would be very different laws of purity that applied to a Gentile and a Jew. Absolutely. So to a large extent, in terms of moral impurity, this is where all humanity is the same. Anyone's sin will defile the land. That is why the Canaanites, according to the biblical text, the Canaanites committed these heinous moral sins, the three large sins that defile the land: murder and idolatry and sexual immorality, and therefore the land was so polluted that it vomited them out, and Israel is warned, if you defile the land in the same way with these moral sins, you too will be vomited out, right? So all of humanity is capable of sinning and creating a moral impurity that defiles the land and the sanctuary and God's name.
In the biblical context.
In the biblical context, absolutely. So Jews and Gentiles are equal in that respect. The ritual purity requirements attached to the partners to the covenant. So Gentiles are not obligated by them. But by the same token, they don't themselves bear some kind of inherent ritual impurity in the biblical text. That's what's important. Later on, the rabbis will attribute, the rabbis actually replicate that. I think the rabbis pretty fairly represent the biblical status quo. They say that the ritual purity laws apply only to covenant partners, so those are Israelites and of course converts. They invent the category of conversion, and so a Gentile can cross that boundary. It's a permeable boundary, and so a Gentile can become an Israelite, and then they are subject to the full array of ritual purity laws. But the rabbis say explicitly they are not, as long as they're not converts, they're outside it. However, we rabbis will attribute to them certain kinds of anomalous ritual impurity as part of their desire to keep a sort of certain social distance. So, for example, their spittle defiles, even though their genital flow doesn't defile. And the rabbis are pretty explicit, in the Babylonian Talmud at least, that the reason they make it odd is so that you will know it's rabbinic and not biblical. They don't want people to be confused, right? But this particular use of ritual impurity, and a very mild rabbinic ritual impurity to mark the difference, is quite different from the way in which purity and impurity language is being used by other groups in antiquity to mark the difference between an insider and an outsider. So at Qumran, for example, or we can go back a little further to the period of the Reconstruction, Ezra, for example, I argue in my book, invents, if you will, the foundation for what will become a different kind of impurity that I call genealogical impurity. He focuses very much on the impassibility of the boundary between Jew and Gentile, and the expulsion of all of the foreign wives. He says Israel is a Zerah Kodesh, it's a holy seed, and that means all others are a non-holy or profane seed, and you can't mix holy and profane. That profanes the holy. In later generations, that will be taken up by some groups, the sectarians who lived at Qumran, into a genealogically transmitted impurity. You defile, not just profane, but you defile. You actually make impure the holy seed through intermarriage. So there's an absolute ban in those sectarian circles on any boundary crossing, no conversion, no intermarriage at all, because there are two ontologically distinct seeds, one of which will defile or profane the other. That is not what the rabbis do. The rabbis do not see these as ontologically fixed identities, and they in fact invent conversion, which is this sort of legal fiction that says, you know what, we'll make you an Israelite. And you can cross that boundary, and you can assume the laws of the covenant. And so I think when you realize that in its context, in its larger context, what the rabbis do with purity language, they are opting not to use that stronger Ezran language and that stronger, they're ontologically distinct or ontologically impure, but and the impurity that arises from Gentile sinfulness is no different from the impurity that arises from Jewish sinfulness.
Interesting. And it would be anachronistic to say that they're moving away from a more racist model of this ontological sense of what's...
But I think genealogically based. I think that's the thing. I like to use the language of the text. And so Ezra uses this language of Zerah. So I think it's fair to talk about a seed-based sort of notion of genealogy. The rabbis will use seed in a metaphorical sense. Gentiles are the seed of Abraham, and so they can be converted. So they'll still use seed language, but they use it as a metaphor.
Okay, so my last question for you then is what's happening socially for the rabbis that they now want to put up these new barriers? And what are some of the moral implications, positive or negative, in the relationship to Gentiles at that time that that emerged from this innovation?
Right. Some of that's not easy to determine because the rabbis don't always bring this right inside their workshop. Right. So we see the results, and we don't always know why. And sometimes even when they'll offer reasons, sometimes it's even their own best guess at why something's happened a couple of generations earlier. So it's not always entirely clear. But when we think about some of the, what's happening in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, this is a time of, Judaism has been through a time of sectarian division just before the turn of the millennium and into the 1st century. So it's a time of identity formation. Different groups are trying to figure out who they are. And certainly Jews have, since the time of Ezra, determined that the Bible is going to be their standard text. But just because Ezra somehow succeeded in rallying people around a given text doesn't mean that he rallied them around an interpretation of that text. So these are the interpretation wars. This is a period of time in which people are trying to figure out who best lays claim to this tradition, who best lives out the message and life that is modeled by these texts and traditions. I should always use a plural because a biblical text is complicated and many, and has many visions in it and many messages. So as part of the identity formation, when any group is involved in identity formation, one has to define who's out as well as who's in. One has to define the other even as one is defining oneself. And there are ways to do it that construct a boundary that is quite impermeable, or there are ways to do it that construct a boundary that is somewhat impermeable. The boundary that the Qumran community drew was an absolutely impermeable boundary. This is one that cannot, and even in the Eschaton, they have an important text that describes sort of the reconstituted community and the temple community in the future. And it will be priests, Levites, Israelites, and then Gerim as a separate class. There will still be no there can be good Gentiles, but they're still distinct and separate, right? Because their word ger did not mean a convert, right? These are separate.
This is a Gentile living within an Israelite
society,
right?
But not mixing, right? So this is ger not used as a convert. The rabbis will use it to mean someone who takes on Israelite identity, right? So they constructed an impermeable boundary. Other groups, I hesitate to say that Paul and New Testament. The common view is that they had this open boundary, that all Israel, it should be everybody. You don't have to be circumcised and you don't have to observe the law, so everyone can join Klal Yisrael in their sense, right? But I think that that's a misrepresentation. They also constructed a boundary. There's also an in and an out in that group, and it's based on belief. And so you use, and they use purity language as well to talk about those who believe are pure and those who don't believe are impure. And it's a very hardwired impurity such that there isn't boundary crossing, and marriage between a believer and a non-believer, or a believer and a heretic was not permitted at all. So I think that the Christian community actually does, in the early days, does really precisely the same thing. It inscribes a boundary around itself. It defines itself as pure and the others as impure, but uses a type of impurity and purity that makes for an impermeable boundary unless there is some form of conversion, meaning acceptance of the belief. And so the rabbis are also unlike Qumran. The boundary that they construct is one that is permeable. The only way they're marking a difference is through a very light ritual impurity, but it's one that can simply be overcome through the decision to accept, fully Israelite status. So they allow for a permeable boundary between the two, but still want there to be a boundary. This was a time when people needed to make boundaries. They were figuring out who they were and deciding who their community was and laying claim to different traditions. And so this was a time of marking territory.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, I think today in the 21st century, the Jewish community is still trying to figure out identity boundaries. And wrestling with conversion deeply, wrestling with intermarriage deeply, and not using the language of purity and impurity as much today. But I think the same concerns are.
Well, I think there's a lot of similarity. I think you'll find groups that align themselves with many of these different groups in antiquity right across the spectrum. And for some, the boundary and the difference between Jew and non-Jew is a fairly hardcore one, and is almost one of ontological status. And so the idea that there can never really be a complete conversion is one in certain communities that I think is very deep-seated. And in other communities, the sense is that each person can, in some sense, recreate themselves anew, and that identity is a matter of, not genealogy or biology, but a matter of conviction and behavior and so on. And those communities will construct the boundary in a very different way that allows for boundary crossing. There will still be a boundary, and there'll still be crossing, but boundaries are there. We define who we are and who we aren't, and that's okay. The question is whether we can use boundaries to kind of revivify ourselves and to build connections and bridges or not.
So if this topic interests you, I encourage you to pick up this particular book. A very exciting recent book is What's Divine About Divine Law?
Yes. Totally different.
And you can pick up all these wonderful books, and also there's Professor Hayes's Bible course is online. It can be accessed online as well.
Yes.
So Professor Hayes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All the best.